Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Abraham Lincoln tops the list as one of the most influential and most revered Americans. As the bicentennial year of his birth draws to a close, let's learn more about Lincoln and his legacy from one of the nation's leading Lincoln authorities. Stay tuned. Dialogue is next. Hello, I'm Joan Cartan Hansen. Thank you for joining us here on Idaho Public Television, on the World Wide Web, and on public radio stations. More has been written about Abraham Lincoln than almost any other U.S. president. The 16th president is the subject of more than 16,000 books. And one man has been called the Muhammad Ali of Abraham Lincoln biographers. Harold Holzer is the author, co-author, and editor of more than 30 books and numerous articles on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. His latest books include The Lincoln Anthology, In Lincoln's Hand, The Lincoln Assassination Conspirators, and Lincoln and New York. Holzer is the co-chair of the United States Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. He's also senior vice president for external affairs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's here in Idaho to speak to the Idaho Humanities Council's annual Distinguished Humanities Dinner and Lecture, and he joins me now. Thank you, sir, for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joan. Thanks for having me.
What is America's fascination with Abraham Lincoln?
I think it's comes from a variety of reasons, but principally he remains the shining example until perhaps President Obama, who reinforced the image that American opportunity really does extend to anybody who works hard. And you don't have to come from royalty or from exorbitant money to succeed in America or American politics. He's the rags to riches, self-educated paradigm that everybody aspires to. And you know, that plus not a bad record as president, not a bad record on ending slavery, preserving the country, and giving his life for both of those causes. So hero, martyr, and American, quintessential American. That helps.
He was viewed as a Westerner.
Absolutely.
And how did that influence how people looked at him from the East Coast, from New York in particular?
Well, first he had to, I'm a New Yorker, as perhaps the viewers have guessed after the first half paragraph of my responses, but he had to prove himself to the East. The reports from the West, from the Lincoln-Douglas debates 2 years before the presidential campaign, was that he was sort of uncouth, homely, awkward, badly dressed, a jokester, a buffoon, effective, yes, but certainly not someone you'd want in your drawing room or even your lecture hall in New York. And that's why one of the subjects I've written about, his speech at Cooper Union, a brand new college that is now a 150-year-old college, still standing on the same place in Lower Manhattan, was the venue for his first New York appearance, his first New York speech, and he absolutely dazzled the crowd, a crowd that was described as the pick and flower of New York. And Horace Greeley, the newspaper editor, wrote, "No man ever made such an impression on his first appearance in New York." He had to have that in order to become an alternative to Easterners for the presidential nomination.
Now, obviously, there's a big split in the Democratic Party at that point, as different slavery and factions began fighting against each other. Was there something about Lincoln that was inevitable as the country was falling apart, as Lincoln's presidency?
People still debate that. You know, one hand, one says that since the Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions, Lincoln was going to be the president. As he was nominated early in May, all of the divisions in the Democratic Party happened later, so he was a shoo-in. But there was also a fourth candidate who had a lot of appeal in border states where Lincoln was hoping to make a good impression as well. And it was sort of I think it was a little bit of a wild card. A few votes switched in Indiana and California, and the result might have been different. Lincoln won handily with the electoral votes, but he only won 39% of the popular votes. It was a very contested, very bitter election, and it was an election after which people felt it hadn't been resolved. It hadn't been answered. In fact, during the interregnum between the election and the inauguration, 4 long months in those days, there were people who were advocating and these are people who supported Lincoln, were advocating letting the House of Representatives decide, throwing it back, doing it over. So it was by no means a gimme for Lincoln, principally because his own party had split, in a sense, too, between those Eastern, vociferously anti-slavery people and the Westerners who were more moderate and could bring the Western states into this coalition.
In your book, The Lincoln President-Elect, you go into great detail about that period after the election and as he's going into office. Why was that such a crucial point in Lincoln's life?
Well, I did the book because I think he's gotten something of a raw deal in history and from historians about this period who have, for generations, advanced the idea that he was sort of hapless and remote in Springfield, not in Washington, didn't know what was going on in Washington with Senate and House compromise efforts and a peace convention called at the Willard Hotel to undermine him and to do its own thing. And that he was basically busy with growing a beard and naming Republican hacks to patronage jobs. I think he did a rather masterful job. When you start with the premise that he believed deeply in the Republican platform plank that said, we are pledged that slavery cannot extend anywhere ever. To have compromised on that would have meant slavery would have gone all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The Missouri Compromise would have been reinvigorated and reinstated. And slavery might have gone on to the 20th century. Lincoln drew a line in the sand. And we can argue about the cost in human life and treasure in the war that was to come. But I think it was a principled secession winter for this president-elect, that he stuck to his guns, that he resisted preemptive strikes to extend slavery by Congress, and he got to Washington somehow in charge, even with his 39% vote.
Was that outward change in his appearance, the beard, the new clothing, did that reflect an inward change in him? Has he moved into the presidency?
People said, who were with him on election night, that almost moments after his only demonstration of exhilaration at his victory, he made sort of a rooster crowing noise when he heard that he had won the city of Springfield, Illinois, his hometown, by about 20 votes. It was always very divided there. He was really excited, and then suddenly, at least two witnesses said this mask dropped over his face, and he seemed to be dripping with melancholy, as if the burdens of the whole world were suddenly on him, and he realized the gravity of the victory, the burden that he had assumed. So I think he changed overnight before he grew the beard. But I think the beard was an interesting diversion and an attempt to add gravitas to his rail splitter image. You know, maybe he thought it would be hard to shave on an 11-day journey east, but he was also used to traveling and being on the road. I think it was an image thing. He was we don't give him enough credit for also being a very wise master and creator of his own public image in the visual arts.
I apologize to viewers. We weren't able to take phone calls because this interview is taped, but I did get some Facebook and email questions. One came from Samantha in Boise, who wants to know if you think Mary Surratt was guilty or innocent in the assassination conspiracy.
Oh, we're jumping right to the...
We're going to jump right to the end.
Past his life to the death. Mary Surratt was the proprietress, as they called her then, of the boarding house where her son and John Wilkes Booth and Booth's weird band of conspirators met routinely and plotted at least the kidnapping of Abraham Lincoln as an end-of-war effort to hold him hostage for the liberation of Confederate prisoners who Booth and his gang thought would make a difference and rescue this war effort for the Confederacy. They probably also discussed murder in the building, but it doesn't matter. If you plan, according to the law, if you plan a kidnapping plot that escalates into death, you're still responsible for the death. I think that Mary Surratt was guilty. I mean, I'm not personally a capital punishment advocate. I don't know how I would have felt with German war criminals after World War II or with the Lincoln conspirators. But the only wise thing that Lincoln's successor ever said, because he wasn't a very good president, Andrew Johnson said that she ran the nest that hatched the rotten egg. And I think she deserved to be convicted for that. The punishment, I don't know, but she certainly deserved to be convicted.
Well, I'm curious, how about Samuel Mudd?
My friend Ed Steers, with whom I wrote a book about the assassination conspirators, also wrote a book called His Name is Still Mudd. There is no way that if a man you knew, who was also as famous a face as Brad Pitt, let's say, knocks on your door and says, out of breath, and says, "You've got to set my broken leg. Come in, Mr. Pitt, or whoever you are. I don't recognize you." It's just not true. He knew who John Wilkes Booth was, and he was a Confederate medicine smuggler, and he was a part of the kidnapping plot. And, you know, I hate to say it to all the Mudd family that's so, you know, eagerly and enthusiastically battles for his pardon, but I think he was as guilty as sin as well.
I apologize for jumping ahead.
That's all right.
They really wanted that question.
That's good.
To get that in there. Lincoln, of course, is known in Idaho as the man who made the Idaho Territory. Now, our chairman of the Idaho Lincoln Commission contends that Idaho has more ties to Lincoln than any other state in the nation.
Okay. Well, I seem to be getting away this year with saying that New York has more ties to Lincoln than any state in the nation. We have a new exhibition at the New York Historical Society called Lincoln and New York, which I think revolves around what I call the Candor and Ebb theory of history. Remember, Candor and Ebb are the people who wrote New York, New York.
Right.
And the lyric to that song goes, "If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere." That's what I contend New York did for Lincoln. But Idaho was important to Lincoln, and creating a permanent Republican majority as he saw it in the post-war period, and an anti-slavery, free territory majority was crucial to the kind of America that he envisioned.
Another question, email came from Gens, who was curious if let me see if I get the right phrasing. Do you think that Lincoln's involvement with Idaho was serious because he made such weak appointments, as in the territorial governors who kind of failed to show up as?
Yeah, well, that was the case in not just Idaho. The Northwest was a tough place to get territorial governors to show up. I'll give you a good example. Abraham Lincoln. He was appointed territorial governor of Oregon by Zachary Taylor. And had he taken that job, history might have been different. But when he contemplated the journey, and you know, his friend Edward Baker went up there and became a United States Senator, so it worked for him. And if he was wavering, his wife put her foot down and said, "We're not moving to Oregon. We're staying right here in Illinois." And that was the end of his flirtation. So, you know, it was difficult to get political allies to make the move, because he basically asked people, for all of these new territories, either people who were established friends from other states to move in and become basically pro-Lincoln loyalists in the new states, or invite people whom he'd never met or knew only slightly at the recommendation of one political faction in his cabinet or another to take a chance on people. It was like his political generals. He had to appoint generals who were representatives of Democrats and Republicans, the Irish, the Germans, to make sure that everybody was represented and placated. Then, of course, they sometimes had to go into battle, and it was not always pretty. But he made the political choices that he had to make at the time.
After his death, Frederick Douglass called him a black man's president, but then later, actually before his death, he called him that, and then later called him a white man's president. What was the change in that view of Lincoln?
Actually, it was after his death, right after his death, that he said black man's president. And then I think over the 11 years that passed between that famous well, not so famous eulogy, it's actually fairly unknown that he said that, and the dedication of the statue of Lincoln as an emancipator in Washington, at which Douglass was the principal orator. Lincoln's unfinished work had not been completed. Some people would argue that it had been even regressed, that the reverse of progress had been made. The promise of voting rights, the promise of equal opportunity had not been met in the former Confederate States. And I think Douglass was speaking for a disappointed African-American population. And, you know, looking back at it, I think most of all he hoped that he wished that Lincoln would have lived to carry out the promise himself. I also think, and it's a complicated answer, I know, that white man's president line has been taken a little bit out of context, because if you read the whole long paragraph, and Douglas, as eloquent as he was, spoke in grandiloquent, long sentences and thoughts and paragraphs. I think what he was saying is, he's the white man's president. It's been the white man's duty to hang his pictures on your walls, raise high his effigies. That's in there. I love that. But here is our monument. This was a monument created through the penny and nickel and dime contributions of free African Americans. Those were the only contributions that went to this very expensive statue. So I think he was saying, here's our alternative view. And then I'm not sure he liked the result, because it showed either a kneeling slave or a rising slave, depending on your point of view. And I think he was worried that that the different interpretation would be ascribed to the statue, that it meant perpetual subservience as opposed to we're on our way up. So it's a complicated question. But Douglas's relationship with Lincoln is endlessly fascinating.
There are different interpretations of Lincoln's life itself. His law partner, if I can make
Herndon.
sure, Herndon, kind of demythologized him post that. But then you come to later authors like Sandberg and others who presented a different picture. Which is more accurate?
Well, you know, Herndon knew him personally and well up to a point. I think it's important to know with Lincoln, and those of us who have worked for politicians, and I've done that in my time also, know that this is true. Even the ones you work with, travel with, almost live with, spend 16, 17 hours a day with, you know them up to a line, and they draw a line to create private space, intellectual time space, family space, and very few people, or if any, cross that line. All of Lincoln's friends, to a man, reported that they felt extremely close and loyal to him, but they knew that he would never do anything for them once he moved on. And by and large, he didn't when he went to Washington, by the way. And that they didn't feel that they knew him in the end, that he was the most difficult person to understand that they'd ever encountered in their entire lives. You know, an air of mystery, maybe, or just remoteness that he kept, and he kept a wall between almost everyone. So, you know, one interpretation is as good as the other.
Do you think he needed that wall to protect himself as he was facing, I mean, the amount of criticism he had to take as a, you know, we think today's politics is ugly. That was bad. Yeah,
and I'll address that, but this shell that he built around himself was apparent when he was a state legislator, when he was an anti-slavery man back on the rise. He was always like that. He would tell jokes, and he would amuse his companions, but he wouldn't give of himself. You didn't know, why did Lincoln not go to his father's deathbed or erect a headstone on his grave? None of his friends ever knew. What was his mother like? The mother that he referred to once to Herndon and never to anybody else. No one knows. He never told anybody. There are things that he just did not share. And I think he would have been delighted to share the burdens and the criticism of the crisis with people. But as my friend Doris Goodwin has shown, he always took responsibility in the public and shielded those who were being criticized, who were members of his administration. He was very good about that.
There's a lot of discussion about his relationship with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. Do you have thoughts on that relationship?
I do. I'm worried that it's the guys who have been piling on Mary, and that a few women are, not so much defending her, but giving a more, a complex and comprehensive view of her very complicated life. And she had a complicated life. She was very well educated, very smart. She was not a country woman. She went to college. She spoke French. She knew Henry Clay. She was very well versed in politics. She and her husband shared a love of poetry. They wrote poetry together. They read it to each other. And it was an interesting love match. She had some serious physical and emotional problems. This is a woman who, she had terrible fourth childbirth. And had women's problems, issues for the rest of her life that, of course, nobody writes about because nobody detailed them at the time. She had real migraine headaches for her entire marriage that got worse and worse after Lincoln's death. And the way she describes them with all sorts of colors and sounds is exactly textbook migraine descriptions that you can read today. People thought that she was crazy. Well, she wasn't crazy. She had migraines. She suffered the death of 2 children. She was holding her husband's hand when he was shot. She went through a lot. She also, people don't know this incident as well as the others. In the midst of the Battle of Gettysburg, she was riding in a carriage, her husband's carriage. The wheel came off. Many of us who study this period think that it had been sabotaged in an effort to hurt the president. Instead, it hurt her. The driver jumped off the carriage, left her alone, and eventually she didn't know what to do as the horses were racing. She jumped and hit her head on a rock. Her wound was infected. She almost died. While this is happening, her husband couldn't pay much attention to her. There's a battle. Then there were the draft riots in New York. He summons his son home from Harvard to help care for her, and he gets lost somewhere in the draft riots. It's a terrible time for the family. Her son said she was never the same after that. That's quite a trauma, not to mention hitting your head and getting a physical injury. So all of this is to say, I think they loved each other. I think they respected each other. I think she had physical and emotional problems. And here's the bottom line with this. When Betty Ford had a mastectomy, she was the subject of universal admiration. No one blamed her for getting sick and diverting Gerald Ford's attention from his duties to pay attention to her. We all felt sorry for her and Gerald Ford, and we wished them the best. She required attention because she was ill, but we're angry at her for not being more supportive of Lincoln when she couldn't be, emotionally or physically. So I just think we've got to cool down the anger business, and I think it's bad for the guys to do that.
Going back to Lincoln's assassination, it happened on Good Friday. How did that influence people's view of Lincoln and his death?
It influenced it tremendously, but if it had happened today with 24-hour news and blogs, if the president, that he would have been eviscerated by either CNN or Fox, whoever the president was, not by PBS, of course.
No.
Jim Lehrer would never criticize a Good Friday theater appearance, but here he was breaking, going to a knockabout comedy on the holiest day of the Christian calendar. But he never was criticized for that. Instead, he was seen as an American Christ figure who had died for the nation's sins. Parenthetically, in all the big cities, it was also noted that it was during the Jewish holiday of Passover. So it was also a solemn but a joyous holiday, and reminded Jews in synagogues that he was a second Moses, who had freed slaves and led people to the Promised Land, but not quite lived to see the Promised Land. That's what happens when Passover and Easter do coincide as they're supposed to. So it was an extraordinary moment, and then Easter comes 2 days later, and it's all the lilies in the churches that have been put there in advance are they're painted black. And sermon after sermon in a country in which 85% of the people go to church on Sunday, and all the Jews go to synagogue, all of the sermons and eulogies are directly compare him to Washington, Jesus, Moses. He is mythologized, sanctified in one weekend. And the coda was that long, long funeral procession that retraced in reverse the inaugural journey north to Albany and then west to Illinois, at which hundreds of thousands of people paid their respects to the body or to the railroad train. Just an unbelievable outpouring of emotion. And I think that's stuck in the public consciousness and has remained a part of the Lincoln image.
And it's a bit of trivia on that, but the fact that his body, there's attempts to rob his grave, and then his body was taken away, but and then reburied it. But before they did it, they opened up the casket. And
this was one of the stories that made me a Lincoln aficionado, because it was published in Life magazine when I was a kid in the 60s. The story of the last man to see, this was the front page, the last man who's to see Lincoln's face is still alive. I thought it was a great story. His name was Fleetwood Lindley. He was an 11-year-old boy in school. His father got him out of school and said, "Ride out to the cemetery, I want you to be here when we do this." And that is, they were reburying Lincoln in concrete. But before they put the coffin back, they wanted those who had known him to look one more time on his face. This is 1901. This is 36 years after his murder. So they used a soldering iron or whatever, the reverse of a soldering iron, to open this bronze, and then they lifted the coffin, and all of the people there said yes. They looked, and this little boy remembered the smell, and he remembered the face, and he remembered little pieces of red flecked all over red, and he couldn't understand what it was. And his father said, well, there was a flag on Mr. Lincoln when he was lying in state in Springfield. It was the remains of the American flag had disintegrated, but he hadn't, because he had been embalmed so many times. He was like a bronze statue at that point. So Fleetwood Lindley lived on in a veterans hospital and told this story, and I remember it vividly.
Now, you were in 5th grade when you first got that assignment. Bill Moyers once asked you the question, which I just loved, how it was, how do you cope with a man wrapped in a myth? And I like to add to that question is, how did you pick one man's life to be your life's work?
Well, the second, Bill's question was really hard. You cope with a man who's a myth by unpeeling the layers of the mummy, you know.
Yeah.
But the great thing is there's so many layers that it can take you 35 years to get down to the bare essentials, and you know also that you'll never get there. There are so many twists and turns and so many interpretations. And if it wasn't about someone who was the pivot of the modern America that we know, for all of its, you know, great blessings and its continued challenges and problems, he was the one who made it possible for us to continue, who made it a better America, an America that really lived up to the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men, all people were truly created equal and had equal opportunity. And yet there was 600,000 deaths in the wake of that commitment. And yet there was still North-South divisions. I mean, how did it happen? Did he do enough? Did he do too much? Was he too slow? Was he too fast? Was he too jocular? Was he too morose? As for, you know, I'm a believer, I guess I'm an old-fashioned believer in the great man theory of history. It's out of fashion now. It's all about movements and people and labor and farm movements, etc. But, you know, in the end, I don't think that America would have survived without this one person. I think his steely resolve and his brilliance as a writer, which we haven't even touched on, as in his willingness to just let himself be exposed for cameras and artists as if he was sort of the Dorian Gray of America, suffering, withering away, wasting away, really, and aging into an old man at 56 before our eyes so that we could have a rebirth. That's a remarkable story. So I think it's been worth it. I've had a great time doing it. And I still thank my 5th grade public school teacher for the first assignment.
We've just got about 30 seconds left. What's the next book?
Wow. The next book is going to be another assassination book that I'm co-editing with 2 friends. We have a group called the Lincoln Forum, thelincolnforum.org.
Which is on our website.
Oh, good. We meet every November, and we've put together our best lectures on the Lincoln assassination to bring out in April. And then I may do a book on Lincoln and the press. I've always wanted to do that.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate you taking time to be here. And of course, as I said, we have more on our website, so check it out at idahoptv.org. Thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us here on Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web.